long-term impact of the Colonial pipeline shutdown. Topic of my conversation today with Thomas Goldsby. He is professor and Haslam Chair in Logistics in the Supply Chain Management Department at the University of Tennessee. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Bob. It's great to be back with you.
Good to see you again. And like we were just saying before this got started, if it's not one thing in the supply chain these days, it's another. And this time around, it's the Colonial pipeline shutdown. So I want to talk to you about what you think that incident tells us about the vulnerability of energy and utility resources to ransomware and other kind of hackers for that matter.
Well, there's the old mantra that's been circulating for a number of years now that there are those entities that have been hacked and are fully aware of it, and there are those entities that have been hacked and aren't aware of it, or at least are not admitting to it. Mm-hmm. And so I think, as business entities, as governments, as individual citizens, we all have to be very aware of the real prospects of being hacked and being taken ransom, as the dark side folks did with the Colonial pipeline. So it is a ubiquitous threat, it seems, and it doesn't seem, particularly when individuals and companies are paying out some share of that ransom, it seems to reinforce bad behavior, unfortunately. Sure. And when it attacks things like pipelines that we're so dependent upon, and I think so few people realize just how dependent we are on those pipelines. You know, we're equally dependent on roads and bridges and railroads and so forth, but there are very few alternative pathways when we talk about pipelines. So those are particularly sensitive points of vulnerability.
So what did we see in terms of the near-term damage of the incident? I know the pipeline's back up and running now. Everything's back to smooth operation. But in the meantime, what kind of damage or impact did it have?
Well, when a pipeline of that significance is disrupted for even a day, it's going to have a considerable ripple effect throughout our economy. You know, roughly half of the East Coast supply of gasoline came from that pipeline. And so when you're talking about several days of that line not being operational, it was just a matter of time before it was going to impact certainly businesses and ultimately the American consumer. And we witnessed that, and we continue to see it. As you pointed out, the pipeline is back up and running, but there's just no way to circumvent those volumes or to redirect those volumes. I think most people will be surprised to learn that about 17% of the ton miles of freight transported in the US go by pipeline. So we are extremely dependent on pipelines, even though it's a relatively small share of businesses that use them. But as this Colonial pipeline example underscored, you know, we citizens are very dependent upon it. And so even a slight disruption is going to be felt by us. And that was certainly a major one.
Yeah, but on the other hand, we sort of caught a break because it was a slight disruption compared to how bad it could have been. What about impact on energy prices and oil prices and the like? Did we see anything like that?
Well, certainly we saw it in the distribution of refined oil and gasoline, and that's what we saw in the eastern half of the United States. I'll have to admit that I was one of those people that had to determine, okay, do I engage in some of this panic buying myself, or do I try to ride this thing out? And we witnessed that in various news accounts and perhaps even firsthand for those of us in the eastern half of the US. So it was something that was experienced by the gas distribution business and ultimately by the consumer. With regard to the further upstream prospects, it didn't really have any impact, as I understand it, on the oil exploration or refinement businesses. It was in that distribution segment. So as everyone who was downstream of that particular aspect of refinery and distribution that felt it, and unfortunately it was a lot of citizens.
Yeah. Ransomware. We're all familiar with ransomware. We've seen attack after attack after attack. Now, combine that with warnings we've seen over the last few years about the potential for undermining or hacking into the electricity grid and other power supplies and energy resources. How does it come to pass that something like this gets hacked so easily against the backdrop of all these warnings we've had up to this point?
Well, I do think that hackers have stepped up their game. You've been the recipient of probably multiple phishing efforts just over the course of this day thus far, and certainly over the course of the week. we are all susceptible to these phishing attacks. And I don't know about you, but I could pretty easily detect these things when they land in my inbox, right? If they misspelled a word or didn't have had a fuzzy image of the company logo or something like this. But they're getting much better, and there's actually some effort now to understand the organizations that they're trying to infiltrate, and things where you get personalized messages from people that seem to know who you are and what you're about, what your organization is about. And again, they're just trying to work their way into your organization and ultimately your network. And I do think that over the last few years, we've seen much greater sophistication around these efforts. And then when you consider, again, just how dependent we are on, as you point out, energy sector, utilities, healthcare services, some of those other primary areas of everyday life that we depend upon, they can make some pretty focused attacks doing a little bit of homework that's available by virtue of some internet research. And again, they've become more sophisticated and more believable. And all you need is one member of your organization to open up the gate, and suddenly you have a flood of risk.
Or one contractor to open up the gate, not even your own
Absolutely.
organization, a third party that gives it, heating contracts and things like that. You have to lock all that down too. So
That's
that
exactly
makes it
right.
even more
We can
complicated.
try to maintain the firewalls on our internal systems, but as you point out, when you get into the extended network, and in order to conduct everyday business, we know in logistics and supply chain, we're relying more and more on outsourced services. And in order to provide the product or service that we might have routinely done within the confines of our four walls, many years ago, we're now relying upon other organizations, and we have to afford access to systems in order to get that work done. So that's a very good point, that it's not just your first tier, your internal and first tier supplies. It could be the larger extended network.
I don't suppose we can take too much comfort from the fact that the government managed to get back a good part of the ransom by hacking into the hacker's Bitcoin wallet. I mean, that was a nice little kind of a victory, but going forward, it doesn't give us any hope that's going to stop this kind of attack in the future, does it?
No, it doesn't seem to. Again, there are these bad actors out there that, whether it's solely a profit seeking venture, or it's something looking to disrupt our everyday business here in the United States or other parts of the world. Unfortunately, it seems to be a pretty high payoff, low risk proposition if you have the skills to be able to pull something like this off. And it's very hard. We think about the ways that terrorism used to work. It's, to some extent, your hands were dirty based upon the nature of the work. Now it's done so remotely. It's very difficult to ascertain exactly who's involved and the means by which they're conducting their work. So as you point out, Bob, it's great to see that we reclaimed a significant share of that ransom. But unfortunately, I think you're also right that we're no closer to necessarily bringing those people to justice, which ultimately that's going to happen to deter some of this bad
And
behavior.
they're outside our borders, as they so often are. Tom, it just seems like a losing battle. When you combine the inability of humans to take the proper precautions with the advancing technology, the idea, the feeling that these hackers are always one step ahead of us technologically, it's just hard to imagine that there's hope in the future for locking down and taking care of these things in a long-term basis. Would that be just too cynical? Do you think that there is some hope based on what you know about how this can be fought?
Well, I understand that it feels that way. And certainly if we continue to take a purely reactive approach to these instances when they happen, and again, we're not bringing people to justice, and in very rare instances are we recouping any of the ransom. So I do think it's going to require a multinational, multilateral approach. There are nations that are harboring these bad actors. And frankly, until you start to make those who are harboring the bad actors accountable to some extent for the bad behavior of those actors, I don't see where it does get remedied in any kind of consequential manner. So it is something that I think is going to involve the highest levels of our government, working with the highest levels of allied governments, as well as those that are hosting the bad actors to make them feel some of the pain.
All right, so maybe there's some hope. But in the meantime, people just need to be super careful and listen to all these warnings that have been out there for all these years. Tom Goldsby, always good to speak with you. Thank you so much. Good luck on the fall term there at the university. I hear you're going to be doing some in-person education. That's good. Maybe get back to normal a little bit.
That's
But in the
right.
meantime, I look forward to speaking with you again. But for now, thanks a lot.
Absolutely, Bob. Always a pleasure to engage with you and the Supply Chain Brain audience. Thanks so
Thanks.
much.